Thank you, Mary. And I just first of all, I want to speak a special welcome to Chris McGimpsey, who's going to give a presentation, Barbara Walsh, and I want to give a personal, very warm welcome to a colleague of mine, an old colleague of mine, Bertie Ahern. And I know Bertie's been in this seat a number of times, and I think he'll agree that it's much easier sitting down there than sitting up here. And if anyone was at the council meeting last night, I can tell you that's true to its word. But look, I just want to say it's very important that we have events like this, that we remember what, we had a very significant year last year, 1916, but this again is a very significant year in the whole Battle of Messines. And I think it's something that we have to remember and continue to remember well into the future. It's not only about remembering our lost, our missing, or our injured people who fought. It was very significant, that particular episode in history, where we realised, I think for the first time, that what separates us in between North, South, Protestant, Catholic, no matter what religion, creed you're from, that we do have more similarities, more things in common than we have differences. And why it took us a long, long time to try and put those differences aside, and we're still working on it. I think what happened in 1917 in Messines really was a seed to what way we could live together. Two communities could live together successfully and in peace. And in that, I want to pay a particular tribute to Mr. Ahern here beside me for his role in what was tried to be done in 1917, bringing that to its full fruition. And I think, Bert, you deserve a round of applause from everyone here in relation to what you've done for that. We always remember the past, and I made this statement a number of times, and we can never forget the past, but we can never stop fighting for the future. And if we don't learn from what happened 100 years ago, be it 1916, 17, 22, or during even the Second World War, if we can't remember the atrocities then and do everything to try and come together, to put our differences aside, to live together as a community, despite what's happening in the world, well then those people have died for nothing. I think we're living in an era now where people want to put up boundaries, they want to put up borders, they want to promote a very xenophobic, chauvinistic, nationalist view of the world. And I think what the battles trying to stop that happening 100 years ago are battles we're still trying to fight today in certain parts of the world. I would encourage everyone from the seminar here today not only to remember and get the facts and figures of what happened 100 years ago, but to try and establish how we can put that into practice to ensure that the world going forward is a more open, inclusive, acceptance place. And for that, I just wish you the very best today. I hope you have a very good seminar. I hope what comes out of it is very useful information. And again, I hope we can all go home to our respective communities and spread the word that it may never happen again, should never happen again, and that we have to make sure that what's creeping in the world today has to be put a stop to. And again, I want to thank you for inviting me here today. As Bertie would acquit as being a previous Lord Mayor, they always give us about 5 minutes at these events before they chuff you back into the car and they're chauffeured off somewhere else. So fortunately, I'm not going to be able to stay to hear this today, but I will get a report from Mary and a few friends in the crowd here today of what happened. And I'm going to just wish you the very, very best, and I hope it's a very good seminar. So thank you.
First of all, thank you all for coming, and it's a very proud day for us in the Association and Dublin City Archive and Library. The sort of format we're going to run through today, folks, is that we'll start off with me introducing the various speakers, and I really am delighted and honoured that these people have come to be with us today. Some very prestigious speakers, folks, so you've got to listen to them very carefully. Each speaker will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes. We will then have a break for a cup of tea downstairs. We'll come back then and have a discussion and maybe some questions afterwards. I will hand over the chair to Dr. Mary Clark, who's the City Archivist, and we hope to end up at about 4 o'clock, maybe half 4 if the discussion goes on. I would ask you, if you have any questions to ask, to write them down, sensible questions and comments during the debate, as distinct from putting your hand up when the speakers are speaking. We have a session set aside for question and answers afterwards, and I'd like you to stick to that if possible. So now, I'll just go over what I have to say for a few minutes, folks. First thing to talk about, literally, is just about the Battle of Messines itself. And what was it about? So, the Battle of White Sheet, Messines Ridge, began at 3:10 on the 7th of June 1917, with the explosion of 19 mines dug beneath the German front lines, strong points along the Messines Ridge. It was the opening battle of General Haig's plan to break out from the Ypres salient and to achieve two objectives. The first one was to capture the Belgian ports at Zeebrugge and Ostend, from where the German U-boats were playing literally havoc with Allied shipping across the North Sea. The second objective of this particular battle was to capture the village of Roeselare, which was a main German railhead supplying German armies on the Flanders front. So to capture them was the main two objectives. It was a battle that placed Irish soldiers from the island of Ireland side by side to capture the Flemish town of White Sheet. Now it's pronounced Vetchkate, but the soldiers used to call it White Sheet, so I'll stick with that. They were placed side by side as a number of measures taken by the British War Office to stem the decline in Irish recruitment. It was a very political, very conscious decision of the War Office to put these two Irish divisions together on the 7th of June. Some nationalist politicians, people like Willie Redmond and Stephen Gwynn, both officers of the British Army who served at White Sheet, used the symbolism of Irish men from north and south together in order to enhance their argument for the implementation of Home Rule. In December 1916, Willie Redmond wrote to a friend of his, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and I'll quote what he said. He says, "There are a great many Irishmen today who feel that out of this war we should try to build a new Ireland. The trouble is, men are so timid about meeting each other halfway. It would be a fine memorial to the men who gave their lives and died splendidly if we could, over their graves, build a bridge between north and south. Had poor Kettle lived, he would have given the world a wonderful account of things out here. I saw a good deal of Kettle. We had many talks of the unity we both hoped would come out of this war. I have been an extreme nationalist all my life, and if others as extreme, perhaps on the other side, will only come halfway, then I believe, impossible as it may be, we should be able to satisfy the Irish sentiment and the imperial sentiment at the one and the same time." Prophetic words. However, it wasn't only nationalist politicians who witnessed and spoke about this symbolism. Lieutenant Colonel F.S.N. McRory, commanding officer of the 10th Battalion Royal Enniskilling Fusiliers, the Londonderry Regiment of the Ulster Volunteers, noted after the attack, and I quote, "All honour to the gallant 16th Irish Division. Here's to the day when the narrow-minded and self-seeking politicians who will no longer be able to prevent two such brave and chivalrous peoples from living in the truest friendship in their own home country, as they lived and died in friendship in a foreign land." End quote. That bridge of reconciliation between North and South that Willie Redmond dreamt of, and which was a central theme of President Mary McAleese's presidency, came about in November 1998 in the form of not so much as a bridge, but in the form of an Irish round tower and a peace park built in Messines. The origins of that peace park go back to a tour of the Somme in Flanders on the 11th of November 1996, arranged by Paddy Hart and Glennie Barr. The tour group consisted of people like this man here beside me, Chris McGimpsey, David Irvine, rest his soul, Andy Terry, Gareth Fitzgerald, and I believe Jerry McMahon, former Chief of the Irish Defence Forces, was there as well. We were also joined by some lady historians, Jane Leonard. I was there too, acted as a kind of a guide and a general runaround. That evening after dinner in the hotel, and I think it was in Neil or Albertris, I'm not exactly sure where it was, but at this stage it was not really relevant. People spoke about what they had seen and experienced that day on the battlefields. It was an open forum. People spoke very much with emotion. Some men even had tears in their eyes. And they spoke about their hopes and ambitions for a reconciled island of Ireland. Men who had seen each other as former enemies sat at the table with each other and talked openly about what their dreams were for this new Ireland we had tried to build came from that room. One prominent ex-paramilitary said, and I quote, "If people in Ireland witnessed what happened here today, they would never again use violence in Ireland." I'll keep his name to myself. And so in memory of the men who died in that dreadful war, and then as an act of reconciliation, that night we decided to build a memorial and a peace park. The committee that ran the project was jointly chaired by Bertie Ahern and Glennie Barr. And so to the seminar here today. In order to mark the centenary of the Battle of Whitecheat and Messines Ridge, myself, Ellen Murphy, and Dr. Mary Clark from Dublin City Archive and Library decided to present a seminar that would reflect the central theme of the Peace Park in Messines, which was and is reconciliation. To that end, we have invited people who have worked for reconciliation within their own political constituencies and careers since the opening of the Peace Park in 1998 to be present here today. Hence, we arrive now at our distinguished speakers. I would like to introduce our first speaker, former Taoiseach Mr. Bertie Ahern. As Taoiseach, Mr. Ahern was a key figure with the peace process and was actively involved in negotiations for the Good Friday Agreement signed on the 10th of April 1998. And I always think it's very dangerous to deviate from your script speech, but it's fair, I think it's important to remember that that man left the funeral of his mother to continue on with the negotiations of the Good Friday Agreement. A very noble sentiment. On the 24th of September 2003, Mr. Ahern and the British Prime Minister, Mr. Tony Blair, were jointly awarded the Thomas J. Dodd Prize in International Justice and Human Rights for their work on the peace process. And if I may, while I have the floor just for the moment, as a personal tribute to Mr. Ahern and the government he led were supportive of the Messines project in spirit and in deed, and in pocket as well, I can tell you. He was kind and supportive to the Dublin Fusiliers Association, culminating in a civic reception to launch our website in Dublin Castle on the 27th of April 2001. He supported several of our exhibitions and projects which contributed to that bridge-building process of reconciliation I mentioned earlier on. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my utmost pleasure to welcome this man here today, Mr. Bertie Ahern.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and thank you very much for organising this event with your colleagues. I think it's well known to people in this room that Tom Burke has been on this agenda for a long time and working hard and giving his time and effort along with others, and that's why I'm delighted to be here today and glad to see so many of you as well. It's good to meet Dr. Chris McGimpsey again. I think it's about 20 years ago since we were at last together. And for Barbara Walsh, of the great work that Glenn Cree have done down the years. I've been there a number of times back over the years when I was in office, and they've always been very, very kind to me. I think this is a good topic and probably a good time. I must say, I used to spend my life in this chamber one time. That's a bit different than the way it used to be. Any of you knew it in the old days. It was the old Victorian chamber, but because of technology, I'm told that they changed it all around. But I think that I used to be in that seat, but it was kind of different shape, different place. It was 30 years ago since I was there, and I think the last time I was in this chamber in a different form, it was back in 1988, so it's good to see the work goes on at the City Fathers. I don't know why they're always called City Fathers and City Mothers, but anyway, they were always called City Fathers, and the aldermen and burgess of Dublin City. But it's nice to be here. I think this event is important, and we come near the centenary of the Battle of Messines, and For that reason, I think it's a privilege for me, and I'm sure everyone, to be here. Great part of my political life, great part of the lives of probably everybody in this room has been spent trying to build a future based on parity of esteem and community consent, and imperative to work together for the people on this island to try and make it a better place for our generation, but more importantly for the generations that come behind us. And I always look back on some of those negotiations I was involved in, which I'm not going to be grateful to go through today, but we look back on what it was all about, to work on behalf of the people in the island, north and south, but to build a society that covers the diversity of identities and traditions, and look on the principles of full respect and equality of civil and political, economic, cultural rights, the freedom from discrimination for all our citizens, and of parity of esteem and of just and equal treatment for the identity, ethos and aspirations of both communities. And that was one of the central paragraphs of the Good Friday Agreement. And of course, it's had its ups and downs over the last 20 years. Thankfully, most of the peaceful society have been ups. Some of the differences and difficulties continue on, but hopefully those responsible for that now will work their way through all of those roadblocks and difficulties well, and I wish all parties and all individuals involved in that ongoing process well. I think they, Chairman, all deserve our support. I know that a successful way forward will be found soon, and as you all know only too well, it's vital that we have an effective executive in place in Northern Ireland to deal with the multiple challenges of life there, and Brexit being one of them, but many others too. There are many opportunities, but there's also enormous challenges to everyone on the island, and I know that the commitment of those who work together for the common good is inspired by so many good people who've been willing to step out of their own comfort zone and their own political preferences to meet the opposition halfway. I have great respect for all of the politicians in Northern Ireland, past and present, who work hard to do their very best, sometimes in difficult positions, sometimes in past legacies of difficulties, to try and do things best they can. One of the greatest days of clear commitment and inspiration was the Battle of Messines, as the Chairman has said, the 100th anniversary, which comes up in just a few weeks' time on the 7th of June, a massive detonation, as he said, of the mines under the German lines announced the start of that battle, and the tactical objective was to capture the German defences of Messines Ridge and thus deprive the German Fourth Army of the high ground south of the area. And from the Irish point of view, something unusual and most memorable, I think, took place. That the Chairman has said the 36th Ulster Division, 16th Irish Division of the Corps worked together for the first time to undertake a successful battle. And shortly after going over the top, Major Willie Redmond MP, then 56 years of age, was wounded a number of times and fell at the heat of the battle. And Private John Meek of the 11th Inniskillings, who was himself wounded, brought him back through no man's land to the casualty clearing station at Locker, where Major Redmond died shortly afterwards. And the story, however, of the 36th Ulster and the 16th Irish marching to and fighting together was written out of the history of both communities on the island of Ireland. These men were Catholic and Protestant, they were Unionists, Nationalists, but they transcended their difference by committing to a common high purpose, and their differences were set aside for the common good. And from a visit to the Somme killing fields, as the Chairman has said, motivated people got together, and those motivated people didn't leave it there. they got at it. I remember meeting some of them when I was leader of the opposition to hear about their experiences and how they thought that experience could move on to help reconciliate it and spirit there afterwards. And I think by dint of hard work, commitment and inspirational leadership over 20 years, they've given the opportunity to literally thousands of people, particularly young people from both communities, to take time to learn, to listen and to understand the real meaning of respect, mutual respect, upon which a truly integrated community can be built. I think many things have happened. I'm sure we'll talk about those during the afternoon from different perspectives. So I've no doubt that Dr. Chris will, who was there at the time. But if you look at the memorial round tower, the Peace Park, the Wider Horizons programme, the International School of Peace. A few years later, President Mary McAleese and Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth and Majesty King Albert of Belgium officially opened the Island of Ireland Peace Park. And that was indeed a special day that gave the benediction of our highest offices to the Messines project, with the support of the International Fund of Ireland, FÁS, here in the Republic, the departments in Northern Ireland, the Community Museum, the International School for Peace Studies was created, and in June 2002 the first participants graduated from that school, and I was there around that time. The building of the Island of Ireland Peace Park, the International School for Peace Studies, have facilitated thousands of people of all ages, faiths, gender, political persuasion, who participated in single identity, cross-community and cross-border programmes, all in one mouthful, but a huge amount of work behind every one of them. And on the 7th of June, the Peace School complex back in 2006 was officially opened. My then colleague Bertie Ahern, Minister for Foreign Affairs, and the Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Flemish government. I think it's been recognised by both the Irish and British governments that the Peace School supported the peace and political processes in key stages, and it did. Facilitated many crucial conversations internally between Republicans and loyalist organisations over that period. And I think it was unthinkable that these conversations would have taken place in times past, but now a whole history and a whole conversation has been built up around that time. I want to particularly mention the people who started it and worked hard at it at that time. I knew about it and was lobbied by Paddy Hart. Paddy Hart was a Fine Gael TD from Donegal. His son is here. A great man. I'd known him for many years. Sparred him across the floor for 20 years at that stage. We didn't agree on much, to be honest, as is the adversarial view of politics that is Leinster House. He is a great man. It was filibuster. He could come in on a Thursday before we had good standing orders. He'd keep the place going all day. For a young fellow like me, he used to drive me mad. But I got to be a great friend with him on this project, really good friend. He was absolutely committed to this project. Got around me to give a load of money to it. His passion for it and his whole work, always thinking of the next step, thinking of new ideas, and great regard for him. He put in a huge effort. I think we built up our own mutual respect away from what is just party politics across the floor of a chamber. But I want to remember all that work that he did, and I wish everybody associated with him and everyone led it very well. Glenn Barr, I met Glenn back in the 70s, and he used to come to Dublin I had a great experience. I wish he was here today. We could relive an experience. He was here with me on one Paddy's Day, and he gave me a great insight into the Ulster workers' strike. Those of you who are as old as me to remember when the fall of Sunningdale, and I decided I'd give him a Paddy's night. He wanted to go, and as those of you who know Glennie, he wanted to have a bit of fun. So I thought, what better thing was for me to bring to a good loyalist than bring him to a Republican pub in Dorset Street on Paddy's night. But I didn't actually plan it quite as it was, because one of the Army Council was in the pub on that night, whose brother was a councillor, Christy Burke's brother. So I had one side of me, I had Glenn Barr, the other side we had Paddy, and we tried to discuss everything that was safe, which wasn't easy. And I rang Glennie the other day. I said, listen, Jesus, Glennie, I couldn't introduce you too much to that guy because you remember the Army Council, and I couldn't introduce Paddy too much to you because you were the Ulster Workers' Council. But they got on quite well, and both of them bought most of the drinks, so that was a good night. But I got really friendly with Glennie from that time on. He didn't hold it against me for walking him into it. A great guy. And he teamed up with Paddy, and they came back to me many times with many ideas of moving it forward. And to this day, and I know both of them have their own difficulties and their own health difficulties, and all they can do is extend our best wishes to all of them and their families. The building of the island of Ireland Peace Park and the International Peace School were great issues, but as you know, we had our own problems here. Back in 1994, when I was Minister of Finance, my constituency changed from north side to south side. That was a culture shock in itself for me, I can tell you. But anyway, I realised as part of my constituency, we had the National War Memorial Gardens in Island Bridge, and you know, the place was a disgrace. It was overrun, overgrown, and it really was a beautiful place. I walked through it, was brought through the area by a few people on a Saturday afternoon, and I spoke to the OPW, and I asked the OPW, I remember the meeting well, I asked the OPW why was it like this, it was their jurisdiction, and they said, well, it was always controversial and no one ever asked to do anything about it, other than I think Gay Byrne. And I said, well, you know, what does it cost to get it going and get it into order? Anyway, the rest of the story is history. It took us about 12 years to have the official opening on that great day when we had huge amount of people from Northern Ireland of all sides down. It was a great occasion, and the reason the opening was that year, quite frankly, and I think the story is well known, but I had decided to open up again the Easter marches. So I used to go to the Easter marches with my father and my mother. Sister Eileen is here, and that had been suspended during the Troubles, and we had allowed O'Connell Street to become a different place during the Easter debates, which was the wrong thing to do. But I said, not going to open up the 90th for the 90th so that we would build it up to the centenary, which is now safely gone, but that if we were going to do that, in fairness, and the right thing to do was to balance it, and we did that. And it was, everyone suggested at the time there would be all kind of problems and difficulties, but there was no problems and difficulties. And the 90th anniversary and the opening up of the commemoration in Island Bridge proved to be a huge success, and it was terrific, the amount of Northern Unionist loyalists along with Nationalists and Republicans all came along to be part of that, and thankfully it is a great place ever since. Tom Burke, I just want to mention Tom in this, because Tom came along to me with some of his merry soldiers, and Tom said there had never been an event by the Irish governments to commemorate any of the war memorials or any of the war things back in 2001. So I said, listen, if you can gather all the folks together, we can have a bash in City Hall. And Tom said, we'll do that. He told me to be 100. He found about 1,000 of them, but that's another day's work. The Auditor General was asking questions about that, but I told him to go to you, Tom. But anyway, they drank more drink than they were meant to do. But it was a great, great night. And again, the Royal Dublin Fusiliers. And people came from everywhere. They came from far and near. They came from all over Europe. Families came home. It was one of the great, great nights. And Tom, I want to quote back to you. I still keep some of my records good, most of them not. But I said at the time that tonight's event is another symbol of the evolution of public attitudes in the state. The wheel of time turns. In 1914, those who belonged to the Royal Dublin Fusiliers would have been regarded by their families and by the powers to be in the Irish Parliamentary Party and the churches as good Irishmen going about their historic duty. And whether their background was nationalist or unionist made no difference, but the majority would have come from a nationalist background. Those who started the revolution in Ireland in 1916 were afraid that Irish nationality was being submerged and that all the country's fighting energies were being spent. So, as often in the past, on battlefields far removed from Irish freedom, when the soldiers who survived the First World War came back, they found a different and a changed Ireland. And that was not unique. It was a situation encountered by returning soldiers all over Europe, and in some instances, traumatic long-term consequences. Memory of the sacrifice of Irish soldiers during the First World War was kept alive in sustaining decades, and a fine war memorial designed was opened in Inchicore. It was not well known that the then Taoiseach Eamon de Valera had intended to open the war memorial, but unfortunately the approach of the Second World War and the need to maintain Irish neutrality made him decide that the time was not appropriate. Sadly, official attitudes to commemorating the falling of World War I tended to be cold and argumentative, and that remained the case until the recent past. I was talking in 2001, 16 years ago. Sean Lemass, the next record we could find, if you remember, Tom, of where Irish governments had mentioned anything about the war, and we had searched long and hard before that 2001 event, was that Sean Lemass in 1966, 55 years or so later, started to make honourable amends, and he acknowledged that the attitudes had been less generous. Anyway, I went on to give the history. I think Tom has a copy of that speech. I have it for anyone that wants it. But again, it took us till 2006, 40 years again later, till we actually had the opening with President McAleese and all our Northern brethren again. So I suppose it is fitting that 16 years later again, we're here. Thank God we're still alive, but it does show that time moves on. The reality is, ladies and gentlemen, huge numbers of Irish men, mostly from humble backgrounds in city and country, signed up to the Irish regiments in the British Army over the last 300 years. And they are part of history. The Royal Dublin Fusiliers had their origins in regiments that served in India, as Tom knows, and they fought in the Boer War. That led the parade into Ladysmith at the end of the famous siege, and they were on opposite sides to Major John McBride of the Irish Brigade, who was not the first time that Irishmen found themselves on opposite sides in wars abroad, and it happened, for example, in the American Civil War as well. And I have great respect for Dublin Fusiliers and for all of their work. A lot of people are gone that were here in City Hall, or not in the civic offices, just at the back here on that night in '71, where I was able to thank a lot of their families and appreciate it, and we do that again here today. But we've moved on a lot. I think the road to reconciliation in the Good Friday Agreement, and all the good work that's happened by my friends in the Unionist Party and in the SDLP, and all of the great work that's been done since and continues to be done, continues on into other parties that took us a while to convince along the way, but thankfully convinced along the way, and hopefully they'll continue to do so. It is my hope and aspiration, the other side of elections, and welcome my very good friend Alistair, who's worked so hard on all of these things, and great respect for his work and ongoing work, that'll continue. I think the work of peace and reconciliation continues on apace. It's not only in the north, it's in the south, as we all know well. I've managed over the years to launch a lot of books now to tell the history that wouldn't have been launched in the past. I want to commend all the people who did so much good work and research. I've been at commemorations in November in different parts of the country, in Fermoy and in the west, where people have cleaned up in memorials. We had recent events in the north. I had some great days, and an event last week, Prince Charles, but I've events with many Unionist politicians, many loyalist politicians, people who've been involved in the various troubles in the north down through the years, of all persuasions and all sides, who've come to Glasnevin, where it's now a fine place, as we all know. Late Reverend Ian Paisley and his Baroness Eileen have been back there with me over the years. We've managed to work with the Cemeteries Committee, funding that I was able to get from them to commemorate everybody who's buried in Glasnevin. That's a bit of an ongoing battle, and will be through the years of the Civil War commemorations as well, but ask everybody to try and support those battles too, where we try and continue to try and do what we're trying to do, which is that we can all respect all of the people who are buried in our cemeteries, regardless of who they fought or were involved with or associated with during their lives on earth. So that continues as well. So I want to, my time is up and gone over my time, sorry Chairman, but I want to thank you and your workers for organising this event. Say it's an honour to be on this platform with everybody that's here, and to wish them all well in the ongoing work and the day-to-day work that has to be continued to be done, and to thank everybody for coming today, and that we'll all continue in our own way to build reconciliation, trust and understanding, because it's the only way that we can move forward on the island of Ireland. I spend a lot of my time in conflict situations in other places now, and it's brought me to understand that it's not only in Ireland. There's differences everywhere, but I think as I've realised, so many differences in the world, I'd need to be around for 10 lifetimes to solve them. So I think I'd spend most of the rest of my life concentrating on the ones around here, and that we'll all work to make it a better place for our kids and grandkids and the next generation. But fair play to all of you for the great work you do in bringing that forward. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Mr. Ahern. And as a Northside up, I think I can call you Bertie at this stage. So thank you for those enlightening words. Our second speaker, ladies and gentlemen, is Dr. Chris McGimpsey of the official Unionist Party of Northern Ireland. Chris has a lifetime's experience in politics, both as an elected member and as a campaigner capable of mobilising public opinion and challenging governments at the highest level. He was a member of the Journey of Reconciliation Trust Committee that built the Peace Park in Messines and opened in 1998. Designated as an alderman on Belfast City Council, Chris was a member of Belfast City Growth and Regeneration Committee. He holds a BA from Syracuse University in New York and a doctorate in Irish history from Edinburgh University. And ladies and gentlemen, Chris might well be the only Ulster Unionist voice we may have in the audience tonight. There's one or two of my friends from the Unionist side who are here today with us. So I would ask you to give this very brave man a very warm welcome and thank you for coming to be with us.
Well, Chairman, thank you very much indeed. I don't know whether I can rise to the occasion after that invitation or that introduction, but thank you. It's a privilege to be here. It's not actually the first time that I have been in Dublin City Hall. I was here once years ago. I was a northern organiser of the peace train, if any of you remember that, when we tried to stop people blowing up the lines and tried to keep the lines of communications, the physical lines of communication between Belfast and Dublin open. And Thomas McGill was the Lord Mayor, I think, and he invited us down for a cup of tea and wee buns. So I have been here before. And I must say, any city whose Lord Mayor's chain has King Billy's image on it can't be all bad. You know, I wasn't sure how to pitch this, so there's a little bit of this is narrative of my impressions doing some of this stuff, and then a little bit of it is more, a little bit more, I suppose, philosophical. I received a telephone call to my office from Glenn Barr, inviting me to attend a fact-finding trip to France and Belgium to consider the events of 1914-18 and if anything should be done. At the same time, Bertie Ahern was making similar phone calls to others. My memory is that the whole idea was that my memory is that it was vague. Well, at least it was vague to me. It was, from what I was coming across, it was overwhelmingly, one section was overwhelmingly Unionist, and the operation. It was well organised, it was well researched, it was well funded. By whom I've no idea. And we went out and we toured the battlefields. We went to various sites, and as the chairman has indicated, on the final night there was a dinner. I think it might have been in either Amiens or Arras. I can't remember which. Yeah, we'll have to check that. The dinner. Inevitably there were speeches from the floor, and I sat back, but eventually I felt constrained to speak. You see, I'd been impressed by all that I'd seen. I'd been particularly, it was my first visit, I'd been particularly impressed by the Ulster Tower. But what had affected me most of all the things I saw, was the memorial at Guillemot. And during that phase of the Battle of the Somme, the 16th Irish Battalion had 4,300 men killed or wounded. Guillemot had been captured, but at an awful cost. The memorial to the 16th, effectively, overwhelmingly, I think, Redmondite members of the Irish National Volunteers, was a Celtic cross outside the Catholic Church in the centre of the village. And it was a wonderful memorial. But you know, our lot had the impressive Ulster Tower, and their lot had a Celtic cross. And to me, I'm explaining this as I felt it at the time, to me this seemed grossly unfair to the point of insult. And of course there was no our lot, their lot in any case. That's how it was viewed at that time. Irish soldiers from all over the island had fought and died. They had been there from the British Expeditionary Force in autumn 1914, through the Dardanelles, where one of my uncles perished, through other theatres of war, and finally they'd ended up in the mud of France and Flanders. I stated that night when I spoke that we, those of us who were the Ulster men, particularly from the Unionist community, should commit ourselves to building a monument to the 16th Irish, which was as large and as impressive as the Ulster Tower, which of course had been funded by the Northern Ireland government. And I must say the suggestion got a positive response. Now, you know, success has many failures and failures, is it none? I'm not suggesting that the whole idea came from me, but I'm suggesting that I hit the same chord as others were hitting that night. We were all recognising that there was something wrong. I saw the imbalance between the 16th and the 36th, and we all recognised the need for all of the island of Ireland to recognise all of its heroes. Now, when we returned to Ireland, a set of, I think it was originally 10 trustees was established and the project was off and running. Of course, the civil servants took over, all the trustees were removed and replaced by senior clerics. It was reduced still further. The Journey of Reconciliation Trust was established, and the rest, as they say, and as Bertie has been saying, is history. You see, what the Trust set out to do, I think, was to build a monument to all the Irish soldiers from the 4 provinces of our island. An Irish round tower design was chosen, and eventually we produced the park as we know it today. It represented them, and it represents us. You know, it was not ever thus. As a child and as a young man, I knew about the Battle of the Somme. I did not know that it had lasted for months. I thought it was a one-day wonder. It was 1st of July. We went out, did well, left, and that was the end of it. I did not know the extent of the battle lines, which stretched for miles. I'd never heard of the Accrington pals who were slaughtered just up the line from us. And I knew nothing of the Irish nationalists who had also fought. See, growing up in my community, in the sort of background I was from, it was an Ulster thing, it was a Protestant thing, it was a UVF thing, it was a British thing. I didn't know, for example, that in the first month of the war, 20,000 Protestants and 14,000 Catholics joined the British Army. I was unaware that during 1915 a further 31,000 Irish Catholics and 20,000 Irish Protestants came forward. By 1916 there were 150,000 Irish men serving in the forces, of whom 50,000 were career soldiers and sailors. Nor did I know, and it surprised me some years later when I read of it, of the 22,500 recruits in Ulster in 1915, 30% were Catholics. In Belfast, of 4,000 Catholics who joined, a little over 900 were Edmondites. So who were the other 3,000? Of the 10,000 Protestants that joined, this surprised me, 4,000 came from the ranks of the UVF. Who were the other 6,000? Catholic recruitment in Belfast accounted for 27% of the city's total. That was larger than the Catholic proportion of the city at that time. And the strongest recruitment area amongst Catholics in Belfast was, yeah, you guessed it, West Belfast. I remember a female relative of mine who'd been born and raised during the Great War, and born and raised in the New Lodge Road district. Tell me about what had happened. I was probably about 12. And I asked about what is the song. Oh, she said, it's pretty much a good quote. She said, on the 1st of July, the Ulster men charged the Germans at Thiepval. They were the only ones who achieved their objective, you know, but they had to retire with around 5,000 dead and wounded. And then she added, and this is the sentence that I remember well, when our Orange men marched to commemorate the battle, the Catholics came out and threw stones at them. See, us and them again. And the success of the Journey of Reconciliation Trust and the Peace Park has been that it has challenged these attitudes. It has become a foundation towards true reconciliation for all of us. Now, there's much in our history that divides Irish men from Irish women. We fought one another often enough, or we reacted in totally different ways to each other's struggles. And the Great War has been the most obvious example. You know, if the glorious revolution of Derry, Aughrim, Enniskillen and Naboyne divided us, then that's understandable, because overwhelmingly we were fighting on different sides. However, a joint struggle against a common enemy has divided this island deeply. The soldiers all marched off to the sound of brass bands and cheering crowds. The reception they received upon return in Belfast and Dublin could hardly have been more different. In Northern Ireland, we lauded their achievements and their sacrifice. In the Republic of Ireland, you wrote them out of history. The creation of the Peace Park became a focal point for people to re-examine and reassess. Historians, journalists, politicians, and more importantly, the plain people of Ireland looked anew at the Great War. It must be said that memorials and commemorations perform a number of functions. They commemorate the heroism of the fallen. They are a visible recognition of their sacrifice. They give an idea of place to the inscribed names. and they may prefer a message visible or subliminal to future generations. Now, the location of the Irish Peace Park at Messines was particularly opposite. It was there that the 16th and the 36th Divisions fought together in significant numbers for the first time. Redmond's volunteers and Carson's volunteers served Britain and the Empire and were recognised as such back home, both by their proponents and by their detractors. But they also fought and often died for Ireland, as much as any man who remained on the island. The rotund and relatively aged Captain Willie Redmond was wounded at Messines, and as Bertie has said, was brought back by another wounded soldier. His body was then, he was then given over to 2 UVF stretcher bearers. In the absence of a priest, a Church of Ireland clergyman who was one of the Padres from County Armagh prayed for his soul. You know what? Didn't matter a damn, did it? In 2007, Fergus Darcy wrote an invaluable book. Quote, it's called Remembering the War Dead, British Commonwealth and International War Graves in Ireland since 1914. It was produced by the Office of Public Works, so it's an official government publication. In the foreword, Noel Ahern TD, who at that time was Minister of State at the Department of Finance, wrote, the graves of the war dead from World War I and World War II, totalling in excess of 3,000 in the Republic, had been a subject for many that have been rarely spoken about. And thankfully, this change in national attitude has been marked by the construction of the Peace Park and War Memorial at Messines, unquote. Minister Ahern, in whenever that was, I told you it was some years ago, 2007. The Peace Park has not only been a recognition of and result of a rethinking by nationalist Ireland of its role in the Great War, it has in itself helped to foster that rethinking. And you know, and this is probably not as obvious, it has helped to foster rethinking amongst Ulster's Unionists. Because most Unionists felt, many still do, as I did as a wee boy, we went out on the 1st of July and we gave the Germans a bloody nose, but we were eventually beaten back and nobody really cared. And that was nonsense too. But you know, in this way the park played an important role in helping to foster Irish-British reconciliation. And this was nowhere better illustrated than when on the 11th of November 1998 the park was opened by the President of Ireland, Mary McAleese, in the presence of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II and King Albert II, King of all the Belgians. I actually had forgotten if I was ever told that it wasn't a joint action, because if you read it properly now, it was opened by Mary McAleese in the presence of the Queen. I actually always thought it had opened with a pair of them, but it hadn't. She just happened to be there, and the Belgians, you know. But nevertheless, for such an endeavour to be marked by the heads of the two countries was the first and literally groundbreaking event. It was to be the first of a series of such achievements. Could we have had a Queen Elizabeth II at the Remembrance Garden up at Parnell Square if we had not had a President McAleese at Whitesheet? Because, you know, enemies rarely, if ever, reconcile and then have their state follow them. What normally happens is states reconcile, and then those of their populations who have been holding back then follow suit. And that is what has been happening. This, I believe, has been the great achievement of the Irish Peace Park. It has been the significant catalyst towards greater understanding and consequently reconciliation. Someday we will all wear the poppy. But I'll give you but these things don't just happen in Messines, and they don't just happen between queens and kings and princes and prime ministers. They happen in things. I'll give you an example closer to home. One other role I have is that I'm Worshipful Master of Dublin and Wicklow Orange Lodge. We started 2 years ago to have a ceremony at Mount Street Bridge each year. Other people have ceremonies at Mount Street Bridge. Each year to commemorate those members of the Sherwood Foresters who fell as they marched into Dublin on that Easter morning 101 years ago. The poppy wreath is laid, it is removed, it is destroyed, and then it's thrown in the canal. This year we will perform the ceremony again, and we hope to make it a bit more formal. Obviously we'll need the cooperation and the permission of City Council and An Garda Síochána. I suspect that it would not have been possible for us even to attempt something like this without the new mode of thinking which has swept this state in the last decade. And that mode of thought would not have come about, I believe, without the initiatives which led to such things like the Journey of Reconciliation Trust and, ergo, the Peace Park in Messines. The journey of reconciliation which we have all been on, Irish men and Irish women, British and others, has been long and sometimes difficult. But we're getting there, and we would not have come so far without such endeavours as the work that surrounded the construction and the continued existence of this Peace Park. You know, I think President McAleese and Queen Elizabeth sounded armistice that day, a different type of armistice. We have emerged slowly and hesitantly from our trenches, and I'm proud to have played a small part in that, Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. And perhaps as a true test of our reconciliation, how many of us will join Chris at Mount Street Bridge next year? Think about it. I'll leave it with you. Our third speaker, we're moving on, is Dr. Alistair MacDonald. MacDonald? Yes. I just introduced Alistair. Medical graduate of University College Dublin in 1974, Dr. MacDonald has been MP for Belfast South since 2005 and was leader of the SDLP between 2011 and 2015. He was a member of the Northern Ireland Peace Forum and a member of Belfast City Council from 1997 to 2001. He was a member of the Northern Ireland Assembly since 1998. And being a native of Cushendall, County Antrim, I suspect Dr. MacDonald would have been a keen hurler at some stage. Correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. MacDonald.
Keen, but with limited skill.
Goes for me too. So, ladies and gentlemen, you know there is a general election in full swing in Northern Ireland today, and Dr. MacDonald is standing to be re-elected as an MP in Belfast South. I think it is a mark of this man's commitment to peace and reconciliation that in the middle of this general election he has taken time out to travel to Dublin to speak to us today, and we thank you sincerely, Dr. MacDonald, for doing so. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Alistair MacDonald.
Well, it's a great pleasure for me to be able to speak to you this afternoon, and I would like to thank you, Tom, for your kind invitation to share some thoughts with you about building reconciliation between nationalism and unionism in this island and how it's begun to transform the island. And I feel, you know, I feel that I'm sitting here on a platform that I don't deserve to be on, because we've the former Taoiseach over here, Bertie, who has moved mountains in terms of reconciliation on this island, and Chris McGimpsey, who needs no introduction in terms of the work he has done in Belfast and indeed beyond on issues. So I compliment them both. Our fourth member here I don't know so well, but I know the work of Glen Cree, and really I feel terribly honoured to be here. I'm delighted that Ireland, in the very broadest sense, is now, perhaps a little late, reaching out, remembering and embracing the sacrifice and the courage of those from the country, north and south, who served and who suffered, and those who unfortunately died in the Great War. There were very few families on this island that weren't touched by the Great War and had somebody serve or somebody injured or somebody die. And it was unfortunate in many ways that the War of Independence coloured and confused and in some ways shut out the important sacrifice that those people made, and indeed the part that they were of the history of this island. Because history is history. Some bits people like, some bits some might want to forget, but it's our history. It belongs to all of us, and we have to embrace it. And I think this is one of the great advantages for me of the last couple of years, in that the Irish government, in celebrating the foundation of the state, have reached out and embraced a lot of the events of the First World War, and the whole thing is taken as one period in our history rather than a them and us approach. It has been very satisfying. It's all part, as far as I'm concerned, of who we are and where we came from. I'm not, and I'm going to own up right off, I haven't been to the Peace Park in Messines, but I'll get there one day. But I've strongly supported its establishment and what it represents. And I can only, as I indicated, only watch and admire the work of Chris and others who did so much when they were involved and make that project happen. So that's roughly where I'm coming from. I wanted, if I could, to open and widen the discussion here a bit, because I didn't want to repeat Chris's story or Bertie's story. But what I wanted to say to you is the work of reconciliation is never finished, and we must never become complacent, because we still have a massive amount of work to do. And indeed, modern day Ireland faces even new challenges on the field of reconciliation, because it's no longer about just accommodating the two traditions, the orange and the green, the British and the Irish. The big challenge for me lies in creating an island that welcomes immigrants, newcomers, with open arms, and does everything possible to help assimilate these people into our schools, our workplaces, and indeed our wider communities. But that implies that we must have the adequate capacity in our public services, like our schools, our health centres and our hospitals, to ensure that our local people don't feel squeezed out. And sometimes we forget that. Sometimes local people can feel, and I feel that has, in recent times, has made a big contribution to some of the controversy around immigration. People are not racist, people are not anti-immigration, but if they find that they're being squeezed out and losing access to a school place or a national school place or a hospital or something, a hospital waiting list, something like that, it begins to bite. The Belfast Agreement was in many ways the high watermark in the Northern Ireland peace process, and culminated after a few bumps along the way, and with a lot of help from our friend Bertie here. It culminated indeed in the re-establishment of devolved government in 2007. But with the promise of peace and stability came the expectation that our people would be reconciled and would reconcile with each other, and that healing would begin. Those expectations have not always been met, and the road to achieving better trust and understanding between our people has often been a rocky one. A major shortfall in my eyes has been our failure to produce the prosperity and the economic uplift that was expected on the back of peace. Truth and reconciliation are inextricably bound together. And yet in our society there are many out there, victims of recent troubles, that have not had the answers they need or deserve. Genuine reconciliation still needs quite a bit of work. But without resolving reconciliation, and by that I mean full reconciliation and full respect for every man, woman and child and their views, I believe we're doomed to repeat cycles of distrust and suspicion, and God forbid violence may intervene here and there. I don't want to be in the business of scaremongering, but with a our society in Northern Ireland at the moment, with no executive and no government in effect, there are some out there who would want to take advantage of that situation. And unfortunately, there are some who, if allowed, have the capacity to bring us back, or to take us back to some of the dark days of the past. We got to avoid that. And if we're to break away from the shackles of political deadlock in the North, then we need to commit fully to reconciling people. And that means each and every one of us. That's not something primarily for government. That's for each of us personally have to reach out and have to engage and have to recognise the hurt that others have felt and the pain that others have felt. The focus of today may be the First World War and its, some of the unfinished business in terms of remembering the sacrifices that people made. But we've got to ensure that barriers come down and distrust and suspicion is removed. There are many victims and survivors of our troubles that live with pain, deep pain, and their suffering is a reminder that at a political level we need to deliver and deliver effectively on dealing with the legacy of the past. And we must be absolutely resolute in getting there. So certainly the aftermath and the pain, the suffering of the First World War is there, and it's great to see it moving, but I do feel that the agenda has to be extended. And one of my great passions is education. I believe education can do so much and do a lot and help people recognise the other person's hopes, the other person's ambitions, and indeed sometimes the other person's pain. I have a father of a young family, and I've absolutely marvelled at the transformative effects that inspirational teachers and good schools can have on my children. And unfortunately, not every child is that lucky. Many people during the Troubles across Northern Ireland were forgotten, and a significant number of our children left school less than able to read and write. And that is a crime. And I look at some of the inner city, parts of the city that Chris represented, that's not the only part, but it's basically there are parts of our inner city that are forgotten about. And again, those are all people, those are all and need to be all part of that broad reconciliation if we're going to have permanent peace and stability on this island. But as I mentioned, reconciliation for me is not just about managing divisions politely over cups of tea and buns. It's about establishing trust, establishing confidence, and being prepared to live interdependently as communities and individuals. And in that, I think this exercise today is a wonderful exercise because it so many, perhaps over the last 100 years, had blanked out the whole history of the First World War and the sacrifices that people right across Ireland has made. But if we're to be fully reconciled, that reconciliation must extend into workplaces, neighbourhoods, social areas, and all the public spaces, so that hurts and dealings of the past are put behind us and we begin to look forward. That's where I'm coming from. That's what I want to see happening. And if I could return more to the Messines theme, I want to compliment Chris and all those involved in building that park and making it happen, and all that it represents. Because that is a vital service, that's a vital gap in our history that was filled and badly needed to be filled. And I want to thank Bertie for the massive job he did as Taoiseach, for the reconciliation he brought to the North, within the North, I watched him operate many times, and he moved mountains. He made the impossible possible, and it wasn't easy. So thank you, Bertie, for all that you did for us. You also created, I remember particularly being at the site of the Battle of the Boyne, where you did a tremendous job there, and I was delighted to see so many Orange men from the north on that site, engaging with that, and the Irish government engaging, because that did a tremendous job and it was a great uplift for all of us. But we will never, certainly I will never, and there are many others who recognise the great work that you did. And, you know, we remember how you left your mother's gravesite to get back to the north and keep hope alive there when things were at a delicate stage. Very, very few people would have done that. So we will be eternally grateful. But I would want to thank and remark also, in terms of reconciliation on this island, compliment the actions at Messines, where the opening of the park you mentioned, Chris, by President McAleese, in the presence of Her Majesty and the Belgian government and others. But following that, that opened the space for Her Majesty's visit here, which was an outstanding success and is still showing benefits to this day. There was work in the lead up to that by Mary McAleese and many other projects that President McAleese had taken part in. Following Her Majesty's visit, I was honoured to be able to participate in some elements of President Michael D. Higgins's visit to the UK. All of this, in my book, removed anxieties, inhibitions, discomfort. And the great thing for me is that business has moved, business between these two islands has moved onto a whole new plane, and it's as a result of that peacemaking by Her Majesty, by Mary McAleese, by President Michael D. Higgins, and by all the others, including some here present. The relationships have never been better, and that has created a whole new space for people to prosper, for people to have a better life, and for things to succeed. One of the great things is, I would mention to you that I never cease to be amazed by, is the fact that Ulster Rugby and the GAA have done a massive job in terms of partnerships, of working together, of sharing facilities at times, and basically that has transformed large sections of the population who are participating in rugby or GAA or whatever. And, you know, I think we must recognise and put it on the record the work that both those organisations have done. I'm living beside a rugby club, Belfast Harlequins. They lease space to a local GAA club. Half the kids in the GAA club are playing rugby on a Saturday and Gaelic football on a Sunday. And that is a tremendous transformation from the barriers that we had 20, 25 years ago. So, Chair, I may have opened out the wider reconciliation, which I feel is important too. And the objective of Messines and the objective of your efforts here today, and to my mind, is but a pathway towards that wider reconciliation in this island. And I thank you for it, because I believe that we have the people in this island, north and south, whatever the politics, whatever the religion, I believe we have the potential to have a tremendous future if we can just manage to get rid of some of our baggage and some of our distrust and some of the barriers to our future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. MacDonald, for that inspiring lecture. We're come to our last speaker, ladies and gentlemen, and then we'll have a break, and I will hand over the chair to Dr. Clark for your questions after our tea, which will be for about 10 to 15 minutes or so. So our final speaker today, ladies and gentlemen, is Barbara Walsh, Chair of Glencree Centre for Peace and Reconciliation. Barbara has been Chair of the Board of Glencree Centre for Peace and Reconciliation since October 2014. Over the past 20 years, she has worked in peace building and restorative justice roles both in Ireland, North and South, and internationally. She has also presented an RTE series on grassroots peace building in Northern Ireland and the border region. Ladies and gentlemen, it's all very easy to talk about reconciliation. However, it's people like Barbara who turn that talk into action by implementing the practicalities of reconciliation projects. And believe me, it's not easy. So to tell us something about the practical implementation of peace and reconciliation on this project, similar to the nature of those carried out in Messines over the years, ladies and gentlemen, Barbara Walsh.
Good afternoon, everybody, and it's a pleasure to be here and to follow such three distinguished speakers and activists for peace on the island of Ireland. So I suppose I just want to do a quick check here. Who knows where Glencree is, or has anybody been up to it in any shape or form? Oh my goodness, that's surprising. At least half of you. So as the top of this said, it's out of the way and it's sometimes hard to find. And I suppose it's been hard to find for a couple of different reasons. And I often think that the history of Glencree in its own way has mirrored the complexity of history sometimes on the island of Ireland. Because in the 18th century it was a military barracks when Ireland was colonised by the British. From the late 1800s, it became an industrial school and a reformatory for boys and young men until the 1940s. After the Second World War, for 4 or 5 years, it was a refugee centre for German children after the Second World War. And it was closed for a while after that, a good while. And from the early 70s, it became a respite centre initially for those running from the Troubles in Northern Ireland at that particular time. So one of the founding members of the Glencree Centre for Peace and Reconciliation was Uno Higgins O'Malley. And it was really interesting because archiving Glencree style, I found an interview that she had done in a box stacked on top of other stuff in Glencree very recently. So I was really interested to hear her voice. So the interview was done in 2004 and she died in 2005 in her mid-70s. So for those of you that don't know, Uno Higgins O'Malley was the infant daughter of the first Minister for Justice in the first government after partition. And she had lost her father. Her father was shot by anti-treaty forces on the way to Mass in 1927. So she herself never really knew her father. But it's interesting how the legacy of that in some way really shaped the impact and the shape of her life. Because she decided in 1974, after influencing and lobbying the powers to be at that time, that she wanted the next generation on the island of Ireland to have a deeper and better relationship, and she never wanted children to lose their fathers or their mothers or their family through violence again. So she was one of the inspirational figures that sometimes, like a lot of women, it has to be said, and I'm saying that in a room full of men, that on the wall, you know, that sometimes that women can get written out of history in that way, and written out of the impact and the contribution that they make, because as we've heard from all of the speakers, the amount of men that went away to war during the First World War. So who was left sort of in the home fires, actually minding families and children and trying to keep home and heart together, except the women that were left after them. So I just want to say a bit about Glencree. For those of you that haven't seen it, it's a bit institutional looking from this place, but it's a kind of an extraordinary place in its own way. And in 2014, the president then, Michael D. Higgins, came up to a summer event that we had there, and it was kind of gratifying to hear him say the contribution that Glencree has made to reconciliation and the building of positive relationships across the island of Ireland beyond and beyond is immense and well recognised, because for a lot of its life, from those early 70s up until today, a lot of the work done at the Glencree Centre for Peace and Reconciliation was done under the radar. A lot of it couldn't be talked about. So there was a time when people came to speak there, sometimes from Northern Ireland, different communities who could not speak to each other there, often came to Glencree and got to know each other and developed relationships, and it is credited in some way in making a contribution to developing and maintaining relationships in advance of the peace process. So as I've said, I won't go through that again, that's the history itself. So I just want to say a bit about the current work of Glencree. And I suppose a lot of Glencree's work has been associated with the Northern Troubles and with the Orange and Green. And a lot of its time has been engaged in that particular issue as well. So the current work and the past work that would be done there would be political, interfaith and community dialogue. So what does that mean? Basically that means where people who have very different views of the world, who sometimes have caused and created great hurt to each other, often meet each other, and after a period of a process of dialogue, sometimes they can see each other's point of view more clearly, and over time we have seen them walk in the shoes of the other. So saying things like, well, maybe if I was in that position, I too would have taken that road. We have a women's programme because, as I said already, we are very aware of the contribution that women make to peace building. And while I acknowledge everything that the three speakers before me have said within all of that, in actually engaging and talking to people on the peace lines and people working in community projects, there are women and men holding the peace together, developing relationships, working together across communities to keep the peace. And a lot of that is not easy, especially many is the time for women who live maybe in hard estates where sometimes there's a lot of paramilitary control within all of that. So we also look to the next generation so that for many of us, it's the next generation that's important. So what is it that young people have learnt from what has gone before in an effort to not repeat the same process again? And that we also are able to give young people the freedom to make their own decisions, because sometimes when people or young people step out from each or other community, sometimes they feel, and they have said that they feel that they are betraying the past and betraying what it is that the people that have done and gone before them have done. So young people have to have the freedom to make their own choices around that and to meet each other and to develop and deepen relationships. So last week I was over at Glasnevin at the museum, and it's extraordinary, as all of you know, that within 100 feet of each other you have Daniel O'Connell, you have the 1916, the people that died, you have the Civil War, you have soldiers that died, and all of them are coexisting in Glasnevin within 100 feet of each other. So our job on this island in this way is to help and support not just our coexistence, because that's a very kind of very thin thing to have, but maybe the reconciliation that we have between the communities that's possible. And reconciliation itself is a process. It's not something that you can turn on and turn off. So what helps us in some way to be reconciled is we need to get to know each other. We've turned our backs on each other for a very long period of time, and we don't know a lot about each other, and we haven't developed relationships with each other. So I think soldiers, in some way or another, regardless of the tradition they come from, at some level they have being soldiers in common with each other. But sometimes on this island, we don't know a great deal of each other. So increasingly, there may be talk about a united Ireland, and sometimes that is seen to belong to one particular view of the world. I wish people wouldn't use that term at all, but that's my view of the world. Because sometimes that term is used as a weapon, a bit like sometimes the Irish language, that it belongs to some and not to others, whereas we know that the island of Ireland belongs to all of us. The Irish language belongs to anybody that wants to learn it and use it. So I suppose just to say as well, Alistair, what you just said was, I think the important thing is that it's not just about the orange and green now here on this island. So for example, Glencree has also now started to work in the area of new communities that are coming into Ireland. It's not that we're providing services for anybody, but what we do is provide a safe space, as we've always done, to enable people to be able to talk about what it is that has happened to them and how it is that they can maybe make a new life here in some way or another. The other thing that you talked about was the post-conflict situation. The people that come to Glencree, many of them now, are crippled from what it is that has happened to them in the past and are just now beginning to talk about what it is that has happened to them. So the whole process, what we find in Glencree, is when people start to get their stories out, to talk to others about what it is that had happened to them. At some level, people, there is a sense of peace in that, there is a relief in that, and especially when they talk to other people about what it is that they've suffered. Because suffering, we have discovered, it does not belong to any one group of people. So anyway, that's dialogue, the flow of meaning. And I suppose I interviewed Father Jerry Reynolds, who's now dead and who was in Clonard Monastery, in Belfast. And I remember him saying to me, the only way forward is the dialogue, so that the Spirit of God can move in people's hearts. So whether or not you believe in God, at some level, in the dialogue process, and when people are in a room, in a safe space, that something happens in that room that's bigger than the people, than the individuals that are in it. People develop that kind of an understanding within that. And the last thing that I want to say, I want to show you this body of men here that we had before Christmas. So we are interested in the area of anything that will create and contribute to peace. And this here was a Glencree declaration in 2000, just in December this year, which brought together many of the different faiths, the Jewish, the Muslim, the Catholics, the Protestants, a whole range of people together that to meet each other and also to make their contribution to supporting diversity in Ireland. We have a Peace Builders programme as well. That's, as I said, young people within all of that. So the last thing I want to say is that I was born and reared in East Clare, and I've lived long enough to remember a strong De Valera narrative. A narrative at the time that was mixed with poverty and immigration, a love of the land, and a frustration with never having enough of it to live on. I went to school in a classroom that had a green map on the wall with a large orange blob on the top right-hand corner. Our stories were stories of dying for your country. There was no living for it. I grew up in a small town. It was really a village, to be honest, but we had pretensions at the time. And at the bottom of the town, at the bottom of the hill in the small town where I grew up, there was a small Protestant church that was derelict. That was derelict as I grew into my late teenage years, and that disappeared into the landscape as I grew older. I never remember anybody growing up asking or telling the story of the people that went to worship in that small Protestant church. Now I wonder, were they forced to go? Did they leave of their own accord? Or was it maybe that the country that we had was too cold for them to stay? And what I say now is, What I say now is that their stories are our stories too, and that in Glencree, when people are together, people's stories become the story of humanity. Just the story of human beings that are caught up in whatever. So our work continues in that way. Thanks very much.